So, as was pointed out, this talk is actually part of a manuscript that I am working on, and the manuscript tentatively is entitled Ambivalent Humanity. So it's the construction of race, primarily of Africa and Africanness in Russian children's, thank you, in Russian children's literature. The part that I want to talk about today and hopefully get some feedback on is the decade of the 1920s. So a couple of my colleagues said, well, why the 1920s? And there are a couple of reasons, but I think for me, primarily, the 1920s represented a decade of freedom, of creativity, that's essentially ceased to exist in the 1930s. And it wasn't, in terms of children's literature, that life, that creativity, that spark, that really doesn't begin to be seen again until the 1950s and the 1960s. And it's really in the 1960s when writers begin to go back and evaluate the 1920s and understand just what a wealth of great literature came out of that period. And for my purposes, just in terms of the topic, the 1920s, in terms of children's literature and the focus for Soviet writers, the focus was mainly on Africa, right? On colonialism, on critiquing colonialism. Once you move beyond the 30s and the 40s, at least from the point of view of children's literature, a very, very distinct shift begins to take place. So instead of seeing narratives primarily that deal with Africa, that deal with the exploitation of Africa, now what you're seeing are narratives that focus primarily on the United States, right? So, and as we all know, this has to do with the Cold War, with critiquing the US, and you see, I mean, there are a lot of children's works, but the vast majority of them look at the state of African American children. And for some reason, I just found the earlier works that focus primarily on Africa to be particularly compelling in terms of the narratives, in terms of the visual content. And so that's why I chose to start with the 1920s. So let me just get myself settled. So the images of Africa that appeared in early Soviet children's literature can be traced in large part to 19th century Russian responses to the institution of African slavery. Many Russian intellectuals condemned the institution, yet their perceptions of Africans as human beings were often fraught with contradictions. Writings that included very sharp critiques of slavery were replete with racial stereotypes. Condemning human bondage did not preclude the propagation of images that reflected racist assumptions about people of African origin. Okay, one work included in a series of historical stories. Hold on one second, my computer is not cooperating. Okay, so one work included in a series of historical stories for school-age children offers this critical assessment of slave traders. They did not consider at all that they were buying real people, tearing children away from mothers, husbands away from wives. They forgot that these black people could feel, love, and suffer, just like they themselves. Now, these statements acknowledge black humanity, but negative assessments are laid further on in the narrative. These are people with completely black skin. They have curly black hair, large thick lips, and a lower part of the face that protrudes forward. They live in separate tribes, obey their princes. They are pagan. They don't recognize one single god, and not infrequently do they kill people in the name of their multiple gods. Now, the author differentiates Africans on a number of levels. First, they clearly don't embody European standards of beauty or accept Western monotheistic traditions. Additional generalizations about Africans are made. They do not need standard living conditions, given that their time is spent running through forests or fields. Exceptional physical prowess enables them to perform manual labor with relative ease. Furthermore, Africans are happy and kind-hearted. They have a natural love of music and dancing. And of course, each of these assertions reflects stereotypes about African physicality and natural artistic inclinations. Similar racial commentary is found in the foreword to a Russian translation of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom Cabin. Translated and widely read in Russia soon after its U.S. publication in 1852, the work played an important role in shaping Russian attitudes towards Russian slavery. In her introduction, the writer Enin Aninskaya writes, "Negroes appear to be the most pliable workers on plantations. First, they are distinguished in terms of their physical strength and endurance. Second, their character is dominated by benevolence, mildness, cheerfulness. True, they are short-sighted, inconsistent, and careless. Monotonous work quickly fatigues them. Europeans have successfully combated this laziness with the aid of whips and rods." And again, we see the translator's sentiments point to African physicality, inherent laziness, and other stereotypes. The first Russian children's work to include such double-sided denouncements is Konstantin Stanikovich's Maksimka, which was published in 1875. While little known outside of Russia, Stanikovich is, in fact, recognized as the only 19th century writer to devote serious attention to naval life and the first to create an authentic figure of the Russian sailor. Freedom, equality, human dignity were central issues for Stanikovich. His favorite decade was the 1860s, when the Tsar liberated the peasants and addressed issues of corporal punishment in the army and the navy. Maksimka is arguably Stanikovich's most popular work, and it presents a microcosm of Russian naval life aboard a ship in the South Atlantic. The crew rescues a young African child whom they find floating in the water after his ship, which was headed for America, collided with another vessel. The boy, weak and sickly, is brought on board and nursed back to health by the ship's crew. When the vessel returns to Russia, Maksimka, as he is now named, is baptized into the Orthodox faith and decides to rejoin the men who saved his life. Stanikovich explicitly attacks the American position on slavery. After rescuing the boy, crew members are certain that he, Maksimka, will forget all about cruel America and the fate it held for him. Yet the genuine concern for Maksimka's well-being is undercut by several negative characterizations of him. When the crew first brings Maksimka on board, he is referred to as the prize of their quest, a dehumanized object, not a human being. This dehumanization is furthered by the absence of Maksimka's personal voice. In a narrative of nearly 20 pages, his spoken words comprise a mere 3 sentences. His thoughts and emotions are articulated by crew members, even after he has learned Russian and is presumably able to communicate with them. This dehumanization is also seen in the animalistic construction of the boy. Once he is given medical treatment and food, he is referred to as a grateful, outcast puppy. As his relationship with the crew develops, he is called a trusting, obedient dog. On various occasions, he is stroked as if he were a pet and follows the members of the crew like a little dog. One might argue that his treatment reflects a condescending dismissiveness sometimes displayed towards children, yet there is a racial element that undercuts an innocuous reading of these descriptions. Maksimka is described as being nimble as a monkey, a source of amusement for entertainment and the crew. Over time, they come to see him as bright, even though he is quote-unquote a blackie. The human concern shown for Maksimka betrays a paternalism which clearly places him at the bottom of the racial hierarchy. Maksimka clearly reflects conflicting attitudes regarding the humanity of blacks. The narrator states that from the earliest times it has always been that Russian sailors show the utmost tolerance to people they meet who are of different races or creeds to their own. Yet their actions suggest a paternalism founded on a presumption of their own superiority. In spite of Stanikovich's professed enlightened attitudes towards race, the construction of race as seen in Maksimka reflects an ambivalent attitude towards Africans at best. So now these contradictory assessments that we just looked at were also seen in works that resurfaced in children's literature in the decade following the 1917 revolution. Africa captured the creative imagination of several Russian children's writers. Some confronted colonial exploitation of the continent, while others pointed to the absence of civilized development and the need for humanitarian intervention. The motivation behind this increased interest is not difficult to surmise. These narratives underscored the flaws of Western ideologies and strengthened the Soviets' moral position in its political and ideological conflicts with the West. Similar to their 19th century predecessors, Soviet writers protested the exploitations of Africans, yet simultaneously displayed a distinct ambivalence regarding their intelligence and humanity. In contrast to 19th century slaveholders, benevolent, colorblind Soviets anxiously became alternative civilizing agents. What resulted were children's texts that reinforced negative racial stereotypes and with varying degrees of subtlety reflected centuries-old pejorative notions about what constitutes Africa and Africanness. Now, Yevgeny Steiner provides a useful categorization of these works in his book, Stories for Little Comrades, Revolutionary Artists in the Making of Early Soviet Children's Literature. Primarily, Soviet children's texts that dealt with racial themes, including tales of adventure, where Soviet children traveled to foreign lands, and narratives that denounced the oppression of Africans and Asians. For the purposes of my talk today, I wanted to specifically focus on these flights of the imagination that children take in 1920 Soviet children's literature, and also actual Russian interventions in Africa. The first narrative that I want us to look at is called Raznie Человечки. And Raznie Человечки, am I in anyone's way? Okay, good. All right, let's start here. So Raznie Человечки tells the story of a young boy who is curious to find out what races live in what countries, and specifically wishes to become acquainted with his proletarian brothers abroad. He studies the intricacies of flying for a year and then is ready to embark on his journey. He first travels to Australia, where he meets Aboriginals, and it's interesting. At the end of the narrative, he indicates that he simply wanted to see representatives of the four races. So in my estimation, and in terms of looking at the pictures, here he indicates that he has traveled to Australia and sees Aboriginals, but he could have just as easily been traveling to Africa and met some of the natives. He first travels to Australia, where he meets Aboriginals, and one of the things that that struck me is, if you look, and is that okay? Good. So if you look at the environment that he is leaving, very pastoral, right? It's clearly a hometown with buildings, farms, things that you can make out. And then there's a very stark contrast, right, when he meets the Aboriginals. Visually, it's difficult, as I said, to distinguish them from Africans. And again, I mean, they are just one of the 4 races that he wanted to become acquainted with. Vanya inquires about their quality of life, and they describe themselves as wanderers. They live off the wildlife they catch, experience periods of hunger, they have only the most basic tools, and wear only the most basic clothing. They also complain that they are constantly bitten by mosquitoes. Vanya is very surprised and taken aback at their living conditions, and on departing from them, he leaves them an axe. One of the complaints they have is that they don't have real homes to live in, and so in his wisdom, he decides to give them an axe when he leaves. And then he continues on his way. His next stop is to Alaska, where he meets Eskimos. Vanya inquires about how they live, and this is something he asks, right, in each place that he visits. How is life here, right? It can't possibly be as good as it is in the Soviet Union. And each group that he encounters has a list of complaints about how bad their lives are. So his next stop is to Alaska, where he meets Eskimos. Vanya inquires about how they live, and they point out their isolation and the fact that they spend so many waking hours without daylight. And Vanya, and as a parting gift, he decides to leave them a radio and tells them, and he encourages them to listen so that they could have some sort of contact with the outside world. He moves on to Canada, where he meets Native Americans, members of the Athabasca tribe. And they tell him, and again, he inquires about their quality of life, and he says that they say that they are Athabasca Indians. Tales are told about them as if they're actually red-skinned, right? And resemble the color of bricks. But as you can see, as they point out to him, we're not redskins. Our faces are actually yellowish brown. And what is striking to Vanya is that they have such imposing, warlike features, but he comes to the conclusion that they're actually very nice people and don't live up to the stereotype that that has been created about them. And in departing, yes. He leaves books for the children so that they may become literate. Now, Vanya's last stop is to China. And what's interesting is that on his trip to China, this is the only instance in which he does not gift them anything. The Chinese actually gift him a number of things. And he mentions, he mentions that they are master artists, paper makers, silk producers, and that they also have a very impressive military. And what's interesting is that when he arrives in China, he's met with respect and praise, and it's clear that he has some sort of affinity with the Chinese. And he indicates that revolution has begun in China. Now, this was written in 1925. When did revolution actually occur in China? Later, 1949. So he anticipates the revolution that is coming, right? 20 years ahead of its time.
They're supporting the Communist Party.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So,
About to.
The Chinese Communist Party is founded in 1921.
Mm-hmm. And upon leaving, Vanya reflects upon how he was able to see people who compromised 4 different races. And what is interesting is on his flight to China, he does not gift them with anything because they already have everything. And the next narrative that I want us to take a look at is V Gostiach u Negrov. And this is another narrative that presents a Soviet child traveling to visit other races. Here, this is young Petrushka. Whose small boat capsizes just off of the African shore. 2 terrifying Negroes greet him and perform what Petya takes to be a war dance.
What's the date of this book?
This one was 1920. Yes, 1920. The boy assumes that the natives are cannibals and assures them that he has come in peace and is at their service. A display, and what is this wonderful display that he makes to show them how wise he is? What's this display? It's a handstand, essentially, right? So he convinces his new host that he will be a formidable enemy by this physical display. Their solution is appeasement, which Petya gladly accepts. And all further on in the narrative, and essentially in terms of behavior, in terms of language, the natives are essentially children, right? And we see this in a number of narratives. And actually, the monkey who comes and steals his clothing is considered to be smarter than the natives themselves. Oh yes, here are the monkeys who are so bright. As their friendship develops, Petya decides that he wants to return to Russia. And in this instance, they help him build a boat. He's longing for home. They help him build a boat, and they return to Russia with him. Petya himself has become a young civilizing agent, and the assumption is that his new friends will now enjoy the trappings of life in the Soviet Union. In form, Kulikovsky's narrative is a light adventure tale with a happy ending. Petya travels to Africa. After a few misunderstandings, he befriends the natives and brings them home to the civilized world. But this happy ending is problematized. Visually, even though Petya, the image of Petya is not very stylized, and if we go back, this one, visually the image of Petya isn't very stylized, but how would you compare stylization to that of, to that of the natives? How would you contrast the two? So clearly, right, the natives have large bulging eyes, very dark lips. Their bodies are contorted in non-human-like ways. So here again, the illustrator is drawing upon common racial stereotypes. The next book that I would like us to look at is is the most problematic in terms of the narratives that we looked at, these flights of the imagination. Детский Разосветки was published in 1927, and it most strongly reflects the Soviet notion of Africa as the other. Poltavsky's narrative does not confront European colonialism, but it does pose broader questions about cultural superiority. In this example, it's helpful to place the depiction of the African child in the context of how the other children in the narrative are visually depicted. And at first glance, the narrative simply tells the story of a young Soviet boy who seeks adventure, and essentially he departs on this flight of the imagination. And here we have young Vanya. And again, even though not very stylized, he clearly looks like a human child. So Vanya departs on his airplane with his pet dog. And the first country that they decide to visit is India. He indicates that they've landed in Bombay. And in terms of the depiction of India, of Indians, what we see is people in various states of undress. We have architectural disorder. As you see, the buildings are all strewn about. Wildlife, the trees, etc. All of these things are growing seemingly out of control without any kind of management. And then, now this is the next child that he visits. So clearly this is an African child. How would you characterize this picture? Just like your initial impressions, what would you say about it?
It looks like Harpo Marx.
Huh? Excuse me?
He looks like Harpo Marx.
He looks like Harpo Marx, perhaps. Mm-hmm. What else?
Unhappy.
Unhappy. I too. Oh. Unhappy? Yeah. What else? Anything else that sticks out about this illustration?
The lips and hair. The lips and hair.
Exactly. The lips, the hair, and the fact that he has no eye sockets. Right? You'll notice. And what about his hands? And his feet? They look more like claws than they do actually human extremities. And clearly, and we'll see this when we look at the other children all have clothes. And the African child is the only one who is completely naked. Next, he decides that he wants to see an Indian child. And again, remember, this is just a flight of the imagination. And an Indian child, a Native American Indian child, stands before him. What would you say about this illustration?
Can you go back?
Go back.
Sure. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know what I'm doing. Impressions, thoughts?
Looks a bit like a devil.
Looks a bit, exactly. He has a menacing smile. Good. What else would you point out? Someone said something else?
Oh, the skin is red.
And what's interesting is that in this text, and again, he indicates that he wanted to see members of the four races. And the black child is literally black, right? The red child is literally red. The yellow child is literally yellow, right? So, yes. So, and what about in terms of his headwear?
He just looks like a plant.
He looks like a plant. He does look like a plant. And in terms of Native American headgear, have you ever seen anything that remotely resembles something like this? No, right? So this is a depiction of a Native American child, but his headgear, that's usually very regal, very majestic, is essentially, as you pointed out, he looks like a plant, right, with feathers just haphazardly placed on his head. Next, he decides, now I want to see a yellow boy. And this is the child that appears before him. Thoughts? Same thing. Very wide, exaggerated features, teeth. Okay, what am I doing? It's very sensitive. Teeth, again, his extremities don't look like human extremities at all. And finally, they all get together and enjoy a good laugh. And again, it's interesting that the African child is still completely naked. And he points out, first he says, now I would like to see a blue child, a little boy. And he notes that there are only 4 races, right? Only 4 human colors. And there is the red Indian who has come from America, the black child who hails from the African shores, the Chinese child who lives in Asia, and the white child who hails from Europe. After spending some time together, he and his dog embark on their plane, and they leave. And after they enjoy bananas, I forgot that. And they leave together. And of all of the flights of the imagination, this one was clearly the most problematic. Why would it have been the most problematic in terms of its reception in the Soviet Union when it was written? What do you think? I mean, the first narrative that we looked at, he traveled with a mission, right? His aim was to bring culture, education to the people that he left. You know, he gifts them with something that they presumably do not need, that they presumably do not have, that they presumably need. В гостях у негров, Petya, at the end, even though he doesn't embark with any specific goal in mind, at the end, he has the forethought of mind to bring these Africans back to the Soviet Union, where they will presumably be civilized. What about in Детки Разноцветки? Is there any purpose? Does he have any noble communist ideal in mind when he sets out on this journey?
No, it's just pure Orientalism.
Exactly.
And
Pure or
depicted as children worth saving either.
Exactly. Right? So he leaves with no particular purpose. He goes, he observes, he leaves again, and he leaves them essentially unchanged, right? As Maxime pointed out, pure Orientalism. And we have the impression, just from the visual narratives, that they aren't necessarily children that are worth saving.
What's the date of this book?
This is 1927, I believe. Yes, 1927. And in response to this work, a number of circles, literary circles, denounced it. Детки Разноцветки came to be classified as a work of Tchaikovshina, or Tchaikovskyism, right? And what did Tchaikovskyism represent? We all know that Tchaikovsky was the great Soviet Russian children's writer. So when you say Tchaikovskyism, what does that mean? I didn't even know that Tchaikovshina was a word until I started working with this text. What does that mean? Tchaikovskyism.
It's just pointless entertainment.
Pointless entertainment, exactly. The fact that he has no goal, he just goes to observe, interact, and leave. And he came, this book in particular came under the fire of Nadezhda Krupskaya, but also another influential group to express outrage were the parents of the children who attended the Kremlin kindergarten. So we're talking about very influential people. And they actually drafted and wrote a resolution about these types of book. And the resolution is entitled, "We Call for a Battle with Tchaikovskyism." And they wrote, "We consider it necessary to call the attention of the Soviet public to the trend in children's literature, which has become well known under the general term of Tchaikovskyism. Suddenly the books of Tchaikovsky and his supporters, Poltavsky being one of them, are being published by the state publishing house. Our Soviet kindergarten is in a stubborn struggle for ideology, for a new existence for children. And in this struggle, the book appears to be one of the most valuable and important means of raising a child. Our enemies also seek to steal our children from us through books. Our enemies wish to subject them to negative influences. Tchaikovsky and his associates have published many children's books, but for the last 11 years, we have not found a single modern book. Their books don't reflect any Soviet themes. Not a single book awakens feelings of social and collective aspirations. On the contrary, Tchaikovsky and his companions develop superstitions and fears and produce books that are clearly counter-revolutionary from the point of view of the aims of the international education of children. And at the very end, they name Poltavsky by name. And again, Tchaikovsky and his sympathizers have published many books over the last 11 years, but we haven't seen one contemporary book. And in fact, there have been many books that are clearly counter-revolutionary from the point of view of the goal that we have in terms of the international education of our children, such as Poltavsky's Детки разноцветные. Poltavsky, who had not been a big name in children's literature, essentially fell into oblivion after this book was published. The illustrator actually left Russia for good. He wound up moving to France, where he was met with much less hostility. So, the next work that I want us to look at is Удивительные приключения Makara Svirepova, which is the fantastic adventures of Makar the Fierce. And this, the author of, and this was actually the first Soviet children's comic series to be published. In general, within the Soviet context, comics were not very popular at the very beginning of the Soviet period. They were considered to be, and as I remember the quote, they were considered to be something that grew out of a very bourgeois context, and they had the ability to essentially make children morons. And so they didn't become popular until much later on. Now, the author of the text was Nikolai Jakov, and he was actually one of the most original representatives of the Russian avant-garde and the 20s and the 30s. He had a very difficult time, as you might imagine, being published as a writer for adults. After the revolutions, his parodies, his stories were very badly received, so he decided to write realistic prose literature. And he became the editor of Yozh, which was the monthly magazine that came out of St. Petersburg that attracted probably the best children's writers of the time. And among his other accomplishments, he is also the first Russian radio broadcaster to have had a program geared specifically towards children. And at the end of the 1920s, he began this series, The Adventures of Makara the Fierce, in serialized form in Yozh. And let's just take a look into, one second, yes. And he says, if we just look at the first page, all of Africa will read Yozh, and Yozh is his journal, he says, and he hops on his horse, and at full force, he rushes towards the steamship. So here we see at the very beginning, it's not a typical sort of goal, but he's attempting to bring literacy, to bring enlightenment, right, to bring education to these African children through his publication. So even though it didn't constitute sort of a traditional Soviet text, the goal was what was important. And so he sets off for Africa. We see him on the ship. And what is, in terms of the other illustrations that we've looked at, how would you characterize his style here compared to some of the earlier ones? Anything that strikes you about it?
Looks like something a child would draw.
Exactly. Very childlike, right? And one of the things that he was known for, and one of the things that he said was very important, was to develop a mode of expression that children could relate to. So in addition to being, to creating these texts, he was also very well known as a graphic artist, although his partner, for the most part, produced these illustrations, right? So, and in terms of its simplicity, how would you characterize it? It's written, it's drawn in black and white, and they're basically very simple, as you pointed out. These are illustrations that a child might have produced. And on his way to Africa, and if you look, they encounter, and all of this happens in one continual scene. He gets on his horse and he refuses to get off his horse the entire length of the ship. Even when the ship capsizes, he still remains on his horse. And once he approaches, and here, this is just Africa, over here, right? This is the shore of Africa, and he is still on his horse, right? He has not gotten out of his saddle. And he encounters, and it's interesting, the very first encounter that he has with the continent is this shark who comes at him aggressively, and he's forced to shoot it. And as I was doing research specifically on this text, it brought to mind, does it bring to mind any other, I'm thinking French, a French series. The Tintin series. Oh, that's right, Belgian, right? In particular, and I don't have any proof that he had read Tintin Goes to the Congo, or the first, I think the first one in that series was Tintin in the Land of the Soviets. But in terms of the narrative, in terms of the fact that we have this youngish man who travels, and in this instance I'm thinking about Tintin Goes to the Congo, and the natives are not portrayed in a very good light. So if we look at, once he arrives on the shore, he's met with natives. And what is their initial response? What do they say? Apias, angliski špion, arestujemy его. So they mistake him for an English colonel who had just been there a week ago, who had burnt down a series of African settlements. But how are they, now, and this, I'll point out that this was essentially a caricature of Jakov, and that that was actually one of the pseudonyms that he used, was Makar Srepi. So looking at how he is drawn, and then how would you compare how the natives are depicted? What are your initial impressions?
He's civilized.
Exactly. He is civilized. He has on an English cap. He has a gun in a holster on this horse. How are they depicted? How are the natives depicted?
Pretty much the same as the owls are.
Exactly.
Grass skirts and sticks.
Exactly. Grass skirts, sticks, and again, their features, overdrawn lips, eyes, noses. And with Africa, what represents Africa? It's simply some palm trees, and there's a crocodile, and that's it. That's essentially the continent, right? In those few images. And they decide that they want to arrest him and actually decide to get rid of him. But he is able to escape when the animal that he is being dragged on goes under a tree, and luckily he's able to flip his legs up and escape that way. But in the process, he sees a snake, And again, this is what reminded me of, if you're familiar with Tintin Goes to the Congo, he embarks on a number of these very unlikely adventures in the wild. And here, he falls into the mouth of this big snake, and he thinks to slit it open and force his head and shoulders through and actually wear it as a coat, right? That would make him impressive to the natives. And they actually fall for it, right? So this is, and this is the final declaration that he makes, is that every child in all of the land should have this journal, yours, right? The thing that he has come to promote. And it says here, right, he's accepting subscriptions to the best magazine for children, yours. And we have these children that are signing up, right, for the magazine. And this is just the first episode. I mean, the series went on for about 2 years. And again, the children, and some of them have distended stomachs, but you see how the human features, physical features, are exaggerated. And in addition to palm trees, now we have pyramids, right? That also fit into the African landscape.
Are they huts? Are they thatched huts?
Oh, maybe they're, yeah, I guess yes. Perhaps they are huts, but with the pyramid shape. Okay. And so the next text that I wanted us to look at, and here there's sort of a shift, and the shift comes when you think about the development of technology, how societies are best formed, how they are best sustained, who benefits from technology, who gets exploited by technology. And this text is tak shtuka, radio, nauka. So radio science is a great thing, right? So visually, how would you just describe the cover? Is there anything telling about where the characters are placed, how they look?
Yeah.
What would you point to?
Well, I think the black one was sort of located as being lower down in the civilizational
Exactly, right?
scale. What's the date on this one?
This one is also, I want to say 1925.
Okay.
And the other one, the Yosh one, was
That was, I want to say 1929.
okay.
Yeah. Yes, this was 1925. Right, so again, you pointed out he's placed on a lower plane. Again, very exaggerated physical features. And how would you compare him to this character? Clearly westernized, right, with a shirt and a tie, and the African character is looking up, right, to this person who is clearly superior, to him. So essentially what happens in the narrative is that a ship is capsized and there is a call for help. And luckily the Africans have, and you see them running out to greet the ship that is, running out to greet the ship that has capsized. These are the natives, and these are the radio towers that have been built. And in terms of radio technology, the first radio broadcasts were done in sub-Saharan Africa relatively late. I believe it was 1925 when the first ones were made. So they go out to help these people who are being shipwrecked. And just in the discussion of radio technology, right? There's telegraph, there's a telephone, radio is everywhere now. How are the continents depicted?
North America's the monopoly now. The plutocrat.
Exactly, right? And very reductionist. I mean, here we have North America is represented by, clearly, is there any way that I can enlarge this? Do you know?
I don't think on that.
Okay, great. Thank you. So North America is represented by this capitalist, a man in high who's in a coat with tails, a high top. South America by a crocodile, right? It's representative. Here we see Africa with its lone native and some palm trees with this radio. A kangaroo represents Australia. Here we have a Chinese person, and what area is this meant to represent?
India.
Exactly, it's India, represented by an elephant. But it's interesting, what is going on here? This is presumably the Soviet Union. This is presumably Western Europe. So what is happening visually here?
Are those trees?
Even the radio towers also.
Exactly, these are radio towers. Exactly, these are radio towers, and this is presumably a Slav. He's in that area, and what is he doing?
He's pointing westward.
Exactly.
He's on the march.
Exactly, and he has someone on the run. If you look at this small figure at the very bottom. So it's very interesting the way in which the world is visualized in very sort of essentialist ways. And this describes the process, how radio science occurs. But it's interesting, if we look at who has access to it and where, just looking at them physically, obviously this person is from Paris. This person is from Germany, from Berlin, London, and this last one, Gavarit Moskva. This is a Soviet worker in Moscow, and this is a Soviet worker in Leningrad. So again, what are the differences in the ways in which technology is used and abused, right? Who does it benefit? Who gets subjugated by it? And if we go further, so here we have, and where would you guess that he is from?
New York.
Exactly. New York, right? But he's definitely an American, right? Definitely not Russian. And here we're told that radio technology allows him to keep up with the stock market, right? It's very, and he's very exacting in terms of wanting his information, how his stocks are doing, and he's also very exacting with this young black child who is shining his shoes. So the radio technology, right, it gives him a sense of greed, a sense of selfishness, and it's this sense of greed, lack of humanity, that leads him to mistreat this young child. But look at the radio here. What's the difference between how technology is used in this situation as opposed to how it is used in this situation? Is there any difference between what's happening here and what's happening there? So знание трудящимся. So what's going on in the second one?
It's for the benefit of everyone.
Exactly. It's for the benefit of the collective. Whereas in this instance, right, technology just enables this greedy capitalist to mistreat and abuse, right, those, and in this case, he's literally beneath him. Whereas over here, technology is used for the benefit of the good. It's used for the benefit of the collective, right? Bringing knowledge to those who work, to the workers. And then the next text that I want us to look at is called Negociaciones y Obediencia, the little Negro boy and the monkey. And what is striking about this is that racial differentiation takes place, but mainly in this text, you see it in physical depictions but predominantly you see it in language. You see it when the natives don't have the language to express things in their world that they presumably should be able to identify. And I just wanted to, I identified a couple of passages in particular that I want to use just to give you an example of how this differentiation is made. Now it tells the story of a young boy who has been orphaned, but he lives in the jungle with his grandmother. And he has his best friend, Nuaga, a monkey, and one day he is captured and taken off to Russia. So he has essentially lost his best friend, but much to his luck, one day a ship passes by. It's a Soviet ship, and it stops on the shore and asks him if he would like to go to Africa. And he decides to go. And they place him in an orphanage, and one day when he is on a trip to the zoo, he sees his monkey, who had been captured earlier and now is in the hands of the Soviets. Now the story is told from the vantage point of the boy's grandmother, whom he lives with. And I just want to point out, again, a few examples where differentiation is shown, illustrated in terms of language and not necessarily in physical depictions. And the grandmother recalls a time when she was a young girl, and she said that Europeans came to her village, and she notes, where we live in Africa, everyone is black. When white people came to our village for the first time, we also pointed our fingers at them. We didn't know that there was such a thing as black people. And she also describes the interaction that the natives have with whites. And she says, try not obeying whites. They will bring a large weapon on wheels. What is she referring to?
Artillery.
Artillery. Cannons. They will bring a large weapon on wheels. From that weapon, they can send fire and iron, which flies very far. Iron and fire falls upon the entire village. How many trees have whites already burned down with the help of those weapons? Try not obeying whites. And she also, one of the things that is also highlighted in this text, when we look in terms of the natives, it's their connection with the land. So the sense of them being natural as opposed to the artificiality that is seen in the world outside of Africa. And one example of this is when his grandmother talks about whites and how cowardly they are for all of their power. It says, how cowardly these whites are. Everybody sees how one of them ran away from the flies. Whites make a fuss when they're bitten by mosquitoes. A Negro, he isn't even afraid of being bitten by a spider with 40 legs. He doesn't even notice its tongues. Whites are afraid of scorpions. Yes, scorpions are poisonous, but why scream when you've only looked at one, as opposed to being bitten by one? So it's interesting that here, again, the emphasis is made on their connection with nature, and whites, in spite of all of their bravery and all of the power that they bring with them, they're afraid of little spiders that can bite you and mosquitoes. So, and this is a much longer narrative. It's not nearly as many pictures, and I would say that this was definitely written for an older child as opposed to the picture books that we've looked at. But I thought it was interesting to bring that out because there are a few other narratives that I wanted us to look at that have the same type of differentiation when you want to point out racial difference. And this one is Malinki Chorny Murzuk. So, anything striking about the color, about the cover?
Same face as the other ones.
Exactly the same face. Good at what else? And even though we're told obviously that he's a child, the look of him, he looks he doesn't look childlike. He looks like some type of man-child, right? Something somewhere in between. And
What's the date on this one again?
and this one, I believe, is, I want to say
1926.
26. Okay. Let me. Okay. So here, again, we have this distorted figure on an elephant, but this, as you'll notice, is not a story of Soviet intervention, right? And very idyllic settings, right? Monkeys that are native, the greenery, and this is his best friend, right? And this is a picture of Mirzuk again, and he's in the presence of these animals that he considers to be his family in a real way. And okay, what's interesting about this is that this is the second page of a layout, and we're told that something is coming, right? They're running towards something, but we're not shown what that something is. We're told, we're given a description of it. And as the village anticipates the arrival of the boat, the reader doesn't initially see the vessel. It's referred to as a large wild animal, even larger than a hippopotamus, right? So you wonder, what could that possibly be? And again, we still have not seen it. And it's only on the next page that we see what has arrived. And the readers describe it as, let me find the quote. The readers describe it as, in a flash, they see its mouth open, and they gallow out of it onto the sand, right? And they all of a sudden, they stand in a row and say, "Hello, black brothers, we are Englishmen who are passing by." But it's when this thing, this beast, opens its mouth that all of these people proceed to exit from it. And this is a very representational image. And even though they say that they are Englishmen that are coming, arguably this could be representative of any of the European powers, right, that engaged in colonial conquests in the 19th and the 20th century. So let's take a look at these representatives. Who are they? So starting from, let's start from here. What does he symbolize? What does he represent?
Church.
Exactly, the church, right? And the church and religion as a form of aggression, right? Aggression over ideas. Who is this?
Capitalist.
Exactly, the capitalist. Does it remind you of anything? Any board games? Any?
It's the Monopoly.
Exactly, it's the Monopoly.
Yeah.
Very much reminiscent of the Monopoly character. Okay, and then this image? Exactly, soldiers. And again, a soldier. And what about this image?
Supposed to be an explorer.
Exactly, he doesn't have a weapon, he just has a walking stick. It looks like a backpack, right? A cap to keep him from the sun. So he's an explorer. And this character?
You're a lawyer.
Exactly. Could be a lawyer, but
Разведчик.
Yeah, no, just
right? So these are all representatives of the violence that was inflicted upon Africa. And again, they announced that they're Englishmen, but conceivably they could be members of a number of Western powers. And so, what happens? What do you think happens when they arrive? What occurs with the natives?
It's like they give them alcohol.
Exactly. They give them not only alcohol, what else do they have?
It's a cargo cult.
Clothing.
So So alcohol, what else? I heard
Tchaikovsky.
Exactly. Alcohol, clothing. Right? And then in the next illustration, what else do we see?
Beads.
Beads. And how does, in terms of, and I want to get back to the clothing for a minute, how do these vestiges of Western culture look on them? Are they fitting? Do they look natural on them? No. Right? So the clothes are ill-fitting. With this person with the alcohol bottle in the hand, the umbrella, all of these things that in a very, very different cultural context would be very appropriate. They just don't look in place, right, on these natives. And again, we see that with these other natives who are gifted with things that somehow don't fit them. So this period of peace does not even last a day. Remember, they indicate that they are only passing through. They're only coming through. They don't have any intention to stay. And what happens? What takes place?
Exploit them.
Exactly. Right? In a period of 24 hours, they are exploited. Right? And we see how it begins. Forced labor, right? Pulling this capitalist around, hauling coal or whatever it was, they were forced to do. And what's interesting is that the natives say that we would be happy to serve you, right? They agree to be submissive. Violence is not necessary with them, and it seems to be only gratuitous in this, almost gratuitous in this instance. But what does that point to? It points to the violence, right, that colonialism represents. And here we see them again. He's taking aim. And it's interesting how this scene is survived, because again, they do not have the language to express the technology that is being used against them. And so they point out, and in a flash, right, there's thunder, right, and there's smoke, and hundreds of Negroes, right? These things fly through their bodies, and for some reason, at the very same minute, they fall, and they don't get up again, and they can't figure out why, right? They don't have the words to express that they were essentially fired on. Right? So it's very interesting how language, again, is being used as a means of differentiation. And at the very end, we see Merzouk, right, again, with his friend, but the ending here is very different, right? And essentially, this is not a story where Soviets come in, civilize, rescue. Basically, it asks the questions, ребята, октябрята, справедливо это? Right? So it just poses the question, is this fair, what is happening? And it leaves the reader to think about, well, what would happen if the Soviets were in that position? How might they be different? Of course they would be different. They wouldn't be nearly as cruel, but there's no answer, there's no help for the natives in this one. And then the last one that I want us to look at is how the young Negro, the small Negro boy Joe, how he became a young pioneer. And here we see, the elephant, we see this young child. What can we say? It's been a theme throughout. This very interesting looking hat. What else? In terms of how the child is depicted. Completely black, right? Completely black, and the only thing that stands in contrast to that are his red trousers, his red necktie, and this is the red scarf. What is that representative? Oh, it's representative of the young pioneers. You knew that. And so, and in this narrative, it's very similar to some of the ones we've seen before. We have Joey, who lives relatively peacefully with his elephant, and then invariably foreigners come. And as we might expect, Joey and the elephant are both taken off by force, of course. And we see them on the ship. He's crying, longing for home. But where do they land? Are there any visual clues as to where they end up?
Paris.
Paris?
There's a soccer court in the background.
Which is that?
This is that got to be Russian. What's this dot? It's the publishing house.
I think it's the publishing house.
And what might this be? Or this?
Is it St. Petersburg?
That's what I thought,
Like
St.
Kazakh
Petersburg.
border or something?
Exactly, and the Admiralty,
Oh, yeah.
the
that's what it
Admiralty
is. They just
spire.
made- because it's a war, not fire.
Exactly, right? So it's interesting that they wind up, right? They wind up in the Soviet Union, and they are forced to work for the circus under very harsh circumstances. They both must perform. Joey is forced to give his money to the ringleader, and he's subjected to corporal punishment. And what I found interesting, particularly about this text, is the fact that they were taken to the Soviet Union, right? They are clearly abused, and Soviet citizens are not necessarily partaking in, but they are a part of the exploitation of this child. So one day he's out on the street, and who does he run into? He runs into young pioneers. And at the end, he decides to join them. Now he has on clothes, he has on shorts, and the elephant is carrying the red banner.
So, what year is it?
This, let's see, I want to say,
Oh, 25. This is so
yeah.
similar to the film Circus.
Yeah.
1960s.
exactly,
Yeah.
very, very similar to the film Circus. So I think, in the interest of time, I think that I will stop there. And what I wanted to do, and I mean, we looked at about 7 narratives, and I could have shown you another 40 or 50 more, but I decided to just give you a representative overview of the types of texts that were being produced. So this flight of the imagination, Africans being exploited, Russians coming in, Soviets coming in to rescue, and all of the different forms, all of the different shapes that takes. What does that look like in different contexts? So again, you know, after the 1920s, when writers are forced to join the writers' union, and there's such a crackdown on creativity, I found that the 1920s was actually the most interesting decade to work with in terms of constructions of blackness and of Africanness. And I think I will end on that. Thank you for your patience in spite of me being late. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for that interesting talk and for the beautiful images. We have several minutes for question and answer. I hope
Please.
that
Ask.
Jane.
This is just informational. So in this last book, I think I keep seeing this character John. That's very interesting.
Or Joy.
Joey, yeah.
Joy.
Joy.
Oh, it's Joy.
Mm-hmm.
So, and who's Joy?
He's a young African
So that's
child.
his name.
Mm-hmm.
Joy.
That's his name. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Uh-huh.
Yeah, thank you. I was just very interested in whether you came across any stories of children flying within the Soviet Union and discovering different races or people. because it's so interesting that so many of these stories are you have to leave the Soviet Union to find different people when, you know, many of even if we just accept these racial categories, many people of those races are living inside the Soviet Union.
And that's an excellent point, and I didn't come across any of those narratives where children did not leave the Soviet Union and go to other countries. I mean, they were all traveling the continents. Even though you make an excellent point, a lot of those peoples would have been found within the Soviet Union itself, but I haven't come across any.
And the children themselves are always sort of like are looking white and Slavic. And
Absolutely,
yeah.
And we saw that in each of those instances. They're very white looking, very Slavic looking children.
In a similar vein, aside from the kind of racial difference, did you come across things that have to do more with kind of urban versus rural, you know, like peasant children coming to the city, or?
No, because all of the Africans were assumed to be rural, which was interesting. So there was no, you know, people living in urban settings as opposed to living in rural settings. And I think that just goes to the stereotype and the racialization of Africans, the assumption that they all live in huts in the jungle, right? And the only time you see that contrast, you know, rural versus urban, is when, well, in a number of contexts, when children are taken from Africa and they're taken to cities in the Soviet Union. So in two instances, Leningrad, when one turns up in the orphanage, here one turns up at the circus. But in terms of differentiating between Africans themselves, they were all assumed to be rural dwellers.
But within the Russian or Soviet context, even a difference between the urban and rural,
No.
as kind of a civilizing mission?
I didn't, and not to say that it wasn't there, but I didn't pick up on any of that differentiation at all.
Yeah, thank you. That was really fascinating. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about circulation in terms of which ones teachers use more, or and in different spaces of the Soviet Union. Can you talk a bit about what was going on in education? I mean, how many people were?
Sure.
So,
well, in terms of circulation, a typical circulation for an average book was somewhere between 10 and 15,000 copies. And each of these books had that type of circulation. And at this point in time, not many are being brought for like individual consumption for homes. They're placed in libraries, right? So even though it may be only 10 or 15,000 that are produced, we don't know how many hands actually touched it, how many children were actually exposed to it. But I mean, this is a time, especially right after the revolution, when Krupskaya becomes very involved in, you know, the theory of children's literature, where a major overhaul is done, and now you're looking for certain things, right, in order for books to be published. It has to reflect, you know, communist goals and aims. Internationalism becomes very, very important in a way that it just wasn't before the revolution. So you see, I mean, I focused on Africa, but in my research I came across many books on Asia, not as many on South America, but the Native American experience. So internationalism in a lot of contexts. So again, I think most of these, if not in homes, certainly would have been found in libraries. And they were and in schools perhaps as well. But the circulation, I mean the production was between 10 and 15,000 was considered average. George, which had the serialized story of Makar, that actually had larger circulation, and it proved to be very, very popular because it was attracting not just Alenikov, but some of the top names in children's literature were publishing in it. So it actually had a higher circulation than the individual texts themselves did.
And another thing, a level of literacy was very low at that time.
Yeah, that's an excellent point.
Maxim?
Hi. It's interesting how all these texts seem to be making a case for this goodness, righteousness of Soviet modernity. It's interesting to juxtapose the impacts of technology. Western technology kills, destroys. Soviet technology rescues and educates. And I'm thinking about some of the cartoons that came out in the aftermath of the Sputnik in 1957-58 in Crocodile, in the Humor magazine. Number one, where you had this plantation and black servants or serfs toil in the plantation. Then the Soviet satellite crosses the sky and they reassert themselves and rebel against the oppressors. So technology rescues again. That's wonderful. I have a quick question over the second text.
The second one.
The second one, the script seemed to be pre-revolutionary script.
That's 1920.
So 1920, right. So when did they change the script? 1980.
It's an official report because the presses were still old orthography.
Or the presses probably were in Prague.
And this one was in Berlin, I
Okay,
believe.
that's
I
what I
don't
thought.
think it was. I think it was published abroad. I'm almost certain. I don't want to make a mistake. I want to say Berlin. This is it. Up.
Oh, there.
He's not this Berlin in 1920.
So can we say that is representative of Soviet perspective when it was published by a presumably white emigre press?
Exactly. That's an excellent point. Someone was going to say something.
Well, it's not clear what the audience would be. Both, and can't see, but the
They weren't important.
Right.
No.
It would have been seen as counter-revolutionary.
Yeah.
Any other?
I just had a remark, actually. It's not so much a question.
Languages?
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I just want to know, was it only in Russian language or any of the...
These were published. Yeah, these were published in Russian. I didn't find that they were published in. I mean, they could have very well been in languages of the other nationalities, but all the copies that I came across were it was only Russian.
It was just something that struck me while looking specifically at the images and not at the text. I mean, these are texts for children, and they're very, very highly stylized, not only in representations of the people, but trees and radio towers and churches and everything. It's just highly abstracted. But what's interesting about the way the human figures are stylized is that the non-African people, too, are also very, and including the white people, are distorted and stylized, but in different ways in every text. And the black characters tend to pretty much line up in every text. They're all the same. So you have weird-looking white people, lots of weird-looking white people in these texts, like the guy who won't get off his horse and everything. But he looks very different from the weird-looking white guy in the other texts.
But
whereas
even
the Africans are consistent.
Детки разноцветки. I mean, when we look at him, he looks like a perfectly lovely Slavic-looking child, but by
creepy lips. He's got pretty creepy lips.
Creepy, yeah. His lips are.
But in some of them, the white people are really weird.
But if you look at him look at him in this illustration, and then by the time, and he already looks kind of different, right? When he gets on the plane, and then by the very end, he doesn't look anything like he looked in the first illustration.
Is that even the same guy?
It is. It's the same child, presumably.
Yeah.
Is this one where they end up eating a banana?
Yes.
Yeah, there's going to be a concern of kind of going native in that.
Perhaps.
Monkey V.
You have a question.
Right, so just following up on Ian's comment that also particularly the, I guess, next to last story, where the English people had brought the clothing and you were saying, sort of ill-fitting, but I also noticed kind of a theme through them, but especially with that cartoon, that there's very little distinction between the blacks and the monkeys. You had the two climbing that pole. I mean, it's very difficult for me to see the distinction there. I mean, maybe just because I'm in the back row and probably need some glasses, but maybe that's why they look silly in these clothes. Who would put clothes on a monkey?
Absolutely, and the way in which Africans contort themselves and they assume these poses that aren't natural to human, right? They're more natural to animals, monkeys, right? Some would say. So yeah, that's an excellent observation. Mm-hmm.
So one of the points that you were making throughout this is you know, you're arguing for the 1920s as a dynamic moment prior to sort of the chill of 30s and social realism. As one of the other, you know, sort of equally dynamic issues at the time was the question of Soviet nationalities policy. Mm-hmm. And people here have already alluded to the fact that the representation here of what it means to be a Soviet citizen is very reductive in light of the realities of you know, the diversities of Soviet peoples. Mm-hmm. And I realize that, you know, we have a variety of texts from different years, but is there any way to map the changes in depictions or the messages that are emerging in these texts that deal with, you know, minority people?
Well, I think the texts that deal with minorities other than Africans, at least visually, they are treated very differently, right?
I'll just say, is it possible to map those against similar developments within Soviet nationalities policy at the same time, you know, not necessarily year to year, but, you know, we're talking about, as you said, ideological work. They are trying to toe a line, and this is the time when the line is very fluid. It is not solidified. There's not a clear message yet, one way or the other, and you know, it doesn't get really hardened until the 30s, until you have, you know, sort of what Terry Martin's talking about, sort of primordialism. Mm-hmm. So what I wonder is would it be possible if we looked at these chronologically, or try to sort of group them thematically? Could you then discern, you know, sort of the shifts that the author, even though they're not under the same kind of pressures they saw in the 30s with the Writers' Union and rock and other forces, is there an effort of these authors to put themselves into conformity with the larger message of the moment as regards nationalities and you know, and the Soviet Union's role towards the developing world?
And I think that there, when you talk in terms of conformity, there was, with the exception being Boldavsky, and his illustrator was Sergei Chekhonin, who was very well established, very respected, and at this point he's moving towards the end of his career, and he openly decided that he wanted to experiment with the grotesque, right? And what better context to experiment with the grotesque than with looking at these children of different races. So to that extent, and we know how the book was panned, but I think the other authors, in terms of depictions and in terms of the goals of these works, I think they tried to conform. But when you look at nationalities, when you look at races, ethnicities, other than the ones that we've looked at, the Soviet nationalities, they're depicted very differently. And overall, I would say that they are depicted in a relatively positive light. I mean, they are essentially seen as, you know, brothers, younger brothers perhaps, who need to be brought along gradually. But they are in no way depicted in the way that we see Africans, for example. So I think that, I mean, and this is speaking in very, very general terms, how those depictions are constructed is overall much more positive, at least from the narratives that I've seen, than what we see in terms of how Africans are depicted.
Yeah.
That sort of gets me thinking, though, because I'm thinking of Yuri Sloskin's book Art of Mirrors, which deals with the depiction of the little peoples of Siberia in that period. And positive isn't the word that necessarily comes to mind. And so I'm curious, how would you contextualize these representations with those of Africans in non-children's literature?
In non-children's literature.
That are being produced at the same time.
That are being
like
produced.
ethnographic manuals or
And
trips.
I mean,
I'm just curious whether you've had an opportunity to compare or contrast.
And in terms of looking at images, I mean, we know that, you know, Russia was not involved in the colonization of Africa. So in comparing them to, you know, Western European powers, there was a much more limited limited interaction, but in terms of visual culture, you know, what they would have been exposed to, what they would have been seeing, much of that was gotten from the West. So travel monologues, histories, ethnographic materials, they had access to those things. And I think in large part, and in many instances, I would say in general, the depiction of Africans was very negative. And I think in many ways, that's what these images draw from. It was, you know, Russians had that contact with the West, even though they weren't involved in colonialism per se. So I don't know if that answers your question. I'm sorry,
No,
I went off on a tangent
I
a minute.
don't want to dominate it.
No. But again, in terms of how ethnic minorities are depicted, they are already seen as being further along, right, in terms of the developmental stages. Africa was completely foreign, right, in many ways. And so the national minorities assume this sort of mid-space. So they're not as othered, right, as Africans are, not as foreign, but they're not as advanced as their sort of older, more developed Soviet brethren, if you want to put it in those terms. And I think in terms of children's literature, that is what you really see playing out in terms of the narratives. And I'm not nearly as familiar with literature that wasn't written for children.
Thank you.
And you had another question?
Yeah, I wonder if you could say a bit more about your story, because it seems like it could be, you know, in this case it's bringing enlightenment of some kind, the printed word, but it also seems like it could be sort of an imperialist exploitation of opening up a new market for consumption. And the fact he's kind of confused for an English, I mean, the confusion seems reasonable in some ways. I wonder, but without having read the text,
it seems reasonable on one hand, but also, I mean, there's certain details that are given. The fact that this is a colonel, you know, the colonel that he's mistaken for had just come and burned down these villages a week ago, right? And the thing that causes them to draw this connection is the mere fact that he has this cap on and that he's carrying a pistol, and that's it.
And he's white.
And he's white, presumably.
You know.
Exactly. But in terms of how it was received with the reading public, it was received very well, and children liked it. I mean, I totally understand in terms of, you know, seeing the propagation of this material, seeing it in the form of being exploitative, but that didn't appear to be an issue in terms of what the reader perceived. This is benevolence. This is bringing knowledge, literacy, right, to those people. It wasn't painted in a more exploitative way.
Jane.
Well, I wonder, yeah, I'd like as well to hear a little bit more about your project as a whole, because you only could give us a little bit, and maybe say how far you're taking it and what you see are the major shifts in this, if you take it further forward. But why don't you think about that for a minute? I just wanted to give an anecdote, because personal anecdote. I mean, it seems to me that these images of Africa as the jungle and people and the morality of it all were extremely powerful for a very long time in the Soviet period. When I arrived in Moscow in 1987, you know, in full-blown perestroika economic conditions, i.e. very little to eat, I astonished when I would get kind of irritated with my soft dissident friends. I would say, oh, we live so much better in Senegal, because I'd just been in Senegal in Dakar with my husband in the summer, and which was absolutely true. We lived like kings in Senegal compared to the way we lived in Moscow. And this, even for your most right-minded or correct-minded dissident friend, it was just a shock. The idea that we had lived so much better in Dakar than in Moscow. So I'm wondering just what's the longue durée of your project?
So my project overall looks at the development of blackness, right, as a trope in Russian children's literature from the 19th century till the very end of the communist era. So in terms of how you see a change, I mean, I focus on the 1920s, and as I think I pointed out at the beginning, in terms of thematics, right? There's a huge shift that occurs in the 1940s and the 1950s, where there are still narratives that deal with Africa, but now the focus is squarely on the United States, right? And Jim Crow and the civil rights movement. And I think that this is where, well, I won't say this is where it begins, but in terms of Soviet perceptions of African Americans, although I don't know that the Soviet government necessarily did it intentionally, but I think that seeds are planted for the perception of, or for enabling, right, negative images in the Soviet mind to be planted about African Americans. And I just think in terms of the texts themselves, I mean, if what you're reading about constantly is children and, you know, water hoses and attack dogs and police batons and all of these things, I wonder if there isn't, and if that's what you're seeing in your media, I wonder if there isn't a shift that takes place that makes people think, well, on the one hand, that's terrible, that's horrible, but on the other hand, maybe there is something about them. Why? How is this treatment being brought up? How does this happen? Right? So it's a very, I don't know, it's a very fine line. Is introducing these images to people, does it, what impact does it have in terms of their racial attitudes over time? So where your intention may be to instill sympathy, right, empathy, perhaps you're doing some other things as well that aren't quite as positive, right? So I'm theorizing, and that's on the basis of, you know, looking at reviews of books and responses to certain things, but that's where my project essentially ends, is basically at the end of communism. And so, you know, Africa resurges again. I mean, you begin to see more books in the 1950s and the 1960s when contact with Africa becomes much more firmly established in terms of countries that the Soviet Union has official diplomatic relations with. When you see more students, right, more students coming to the Soviet Union, and that's where there's this attempt to sort of reintroduce or introduce these foreigners to the Russian reading public and to the children's reading public as well. So there's a lull there for a few decades, and then by the 50s, 60s, you see those types of texts emerging again.
Well, I think we're just about out of time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.